Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor, the Program Director for the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm very pleased to welcome you this evening to tonight's literature lecture, which is part of the Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. The Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series is supported in part by the public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen is a non-profit organization that was founded in 1785. And for those of you who this might be your first visit, you will find information on the Society on the blue postcard on your chair. The Society's first lecture was in 1837, and tonight's lecture continues that distinguished tradition. The space you're in tonight, of course, is our library. Founded in 1820, it is the second oldest library in New York City and one of the city's 3 remaining membership circulating libraries. And I also want to mention, for those of you who might be interested, you will find information on library membership on the registration table. Tonight's lecture features the Eakins Press Foundation. And this is part of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen's ongoing showcase of independent presses in New York City. Peter Kayafas, director of the Eakins Press Foundation, is going to discuss the newly published book, Oh, Write My Name, American Portraits, Harlem Heroes, in addition to describing the philosophy and history of the press. And I will just mention at this point that you will be able to buy a copy of this book after the lecture. The Eakins Press Foundation is a not-for-profit educational publisher that for the last 50 years has been dedicated to the advancement of literature and art through excellence of presentation. In addition to his work with Eakins Press, Peter is also a photographer, curator, and teacher. His photographs have been widely exhibited and are in the collections of numerous museums and galleries throughout the United States. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Peter.
Well, good evening. And thanks, Karen, for that nice introduction. It's pretty amazing to be in this room. We've had a couple of parties here. I'm happy to say that this is a bit of home for me. The Eakins Press Foundation is upstairs on the 4th floor. How about that? We don't quite have a history as long as the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, but we do have a history that is approaching 50 years. In fact, next year is our 50th anniversary. So we'll be celebrating that in some capacity, probably by publishing a book, but probably also by having a party. But I want to just give you a little bit of an outline of what is going to happen this evening. After I thank Karen again and the General Society for hosting me, and Milena for helping out with audio and technical, Karen Lee, who is the Eakins Press Foundation's program coordinator and a dynamo, Karina Kennedy is helping us sell books this evening, and Meg, if Meg's here, is going to, I think, help later on in the evening when we have time for questions. And we'll just ask, and I'll repeat it then, that you use the microphone because they are recording the evening. We also have a couple of Eakins Press Foundation authors in the house. Randy Borscheit, who is the editor of our book, Lincoln Kirstine's Program Notes, which you'll see represented up here, and Jed Pearl, who was the author of our last book before the one that we're going to talk in detail about this evening called Magicians and Charlatans. So I want to spend the first part of tonight's talk giving you a little bit of the background and the history of the press because I think it's very unusual. I don't know that it's unique, but it's certainly unusual, and I'll give you a little bit of a description and sense of how I came to be involved with it. There's a man named Leslie Katz, who had a very interesting history himself. Was born in Baltimore to a father who was a Lithuanian Jew who had immigrated to the United States in the late 19-teens and settled in Baltimore and founded an advertising company. And there's a kind of a wonderful long story that I'll make as short as I can and still try to convey some of what is, I think, so moving about how the Eakins Press Foundation actually began. And that is that during his childhood, Leslie grew up with lots of wonderful paintings on the walls of his house. It turned out that his dad, Joe Katz, was very interested in American painting, particularly the painting that was being done at that time and for the couple of decades earlier than it. So among those painters, Thomas Eakins, but also Prendergast and John Sloan and various people of that school and of the Ashcan School. When Leslie went off to Black Mountain College in the 1930s, he met his wife, Jane Mayhall, who was one of our great poets and feminists in the middle part of the 20th century, who died in 2009. And after Black Mountain, after a brief stint in the Army, after which he was discharged because somebody dropped a machine gun on his back before he was deployed, he came to New York and he started producing plays in Brooklyn. And writing for Arts Magazine, which at the time was one of the great art journals. And he was there at the same time that Hilton Kramer was there. Some people may be familiar with Hilton Kramer. And James Mello, who is one of our great biographers, both men now dead. And Leslie passed in 1997. I'll get into how I met him in a minute. But it was in that period in the 1950s that he was writing for the journal Arts that he came upon a collection of Thomas Eakins paintings at the Nerdler Gallery. I believe it was 1956. And had always been a great proponent of the, in his opinion, much maligned Thomas Eakins, who has been largely misunderstood even to this day. And it was his idea that he would use this exhibition of particularly good well-known central paintings and sculptures from Eakins' career as an opportunity to try to rewrite a little bit of the misunderstanding, rewrite the history. So he published a long article in Arts Magazine that year, but it was after spending a week at the gallery looking at the pictures that he went to the person who was the manager at that time and said, "I hope you don't find this at all rude, but would you mind telling me whose collection this is?" And he was taken aback and he said, "You mean you don't know? It's your father's." And so this was in the late 1950s, and Leslie, of course, went home, I imagine, of course, who knows how this actually happened, immediately and called his father and said, "Why don't you let me be the agent for the sale of your paintings?" And it came to pass that Leslie brokered a sale to Joe Hirshhorn, and it's to this day that the Thomas Eakins paintings at the center part of the Hirshhorn collection come from Leslie and Leslie's family. So it was no surprise in 1965 when Leslie was deciding to start a press that he named it for Thomas Eakins. Now, it's not just the name Thomas Eakins that is meant to convey some of the philosophy of the press. It's also two of the first authors, Walker Evans, perhaps our greatest American photographer from the 20th century, and Walt Whitman. And I'll get to the first two books in a minute, but I want to pause on this wonderful photograph of Leslie and Jane in their apartment on Remsen Street in Brooklyn Heights. We think it was either 1965 or 1966, and it was made by Walker Evans. And that's important because it was right around this time that Leslie met Walker, and this was a period in Walker's own life, many years after his famous 1938 exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, American Photographs had established him as one of the great photographers in the history of the medium, at that point, rather short history. But by 1965, Walker's, like happens to many artists, his reputation was largely based on that flashpoint of creativity when he was working for the Roosevelt administration, the Farm Security Administration, as a photographer deployed in Alabama, mostly. And he and Leslie had a great affinity for one another, and Leslie shared with him his interest in starting the Eakins Press. And Walker said, "Well, let's do a book." And so there were two books that came out more or less simultaneously that, along with the name Eakins, were meant to set the tone and the philosophy for what would be published for the foreseeable future. The Eakins Press Foundation publishes mostly books about American art and American culture that celebrate the individual artist in society struggling to make work and to communicate things of value other than commercial value. We've always published a small-ish edition, 2,500 or 3,000 copies. We've been not-for-profit since the 1970s, 1973 to be exact. And Leslie took great care in making an exact facsimile of the 1855 Leaves of Grass and releasing also this volume, Message from the Interior. Leaves of Grass was remarkable, as some of you may know, that Whitman himself set some of the pages of type, and also wrote some of the reviews under a pseudonym for the book, which we issued. The only part of the book that is not an exact facsimile of the original 1855 at the library, at the New York Public Library, which was the copy we used to make this. The only edition really is a collection of reviews from the time, several of which were written by Whitman himself, which are, I think, quite wonderful. So the Evans book was quite unusual for a photography book, much less so now, but in 1966 when these books came out, there were only 12 photographs in it, and it was slightly larger than 12 by 12 inches square, and it was reproduced in a process called sheet-fed gravure, which was really just the rotogravure printing of the time. It was the least expensive printing, and in keeping with Leslie's philosophy of democracy of printing, democracy of production, but at the highest possible level, he went out to a press in Moonachie, New Jersey, and ingratiated himself to the pressman who had probably been there for 50 years publishing advertising inserts, and said, "Can you figure out a way to get a black that is like the black on a butterfly's wing?" And that was something that Leslie talked about again and again and again throughout his life. I didn't meet him, obviously, until quite a bit after this book, but it was a sort of mantra for how he wanted the reproduction of black and white photographs to look. And you'll hear it again when we get a little bit further along and talk about the Van Vechten pictures. But the volume was also unusual because it was a representation of Walker's work other than the 1936, 37, 38 work, which had become so famous. And so Leslie and Walker worked together to edit these 12 pictures in a way that would present Walker's work other than or differently than how he had come to be pigeonholed as the 1938 Depression-era photographer. It's also indicative of Leslie's ideas about publishing photography books, and also very unusual at the time that he made many of the books, left many of the books unbound so that the prints could be hung on the wall, not so much as reproductions, but as actual photographs. And that was another part of the philosophy of how he wanted pictures to look in books, that they shouldn't just be reproductions, they should be, in their own quality, an actual photograph. So after the 1960s, in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, Leslie published books by a number of his friends. He was friends with Jean Garry, he was friends with a woman named Irene Orgel, and he published books of poetry by his wife, Jane Mayhall. I'm not going to show you everything that we published. I'm trying to show a sort of lineage that leads to the Oh Write My Name book, the Van Vechten book, and also to the preview of our book coming out in the fall that I'm going to show you in closing. Now, Leslie was a great editor, and he had great ideas about the kinds of things that the press should publish. These 4 books here, I think, are kind of exciting examples. Of course, these are pictures on a screen. And the thing about Eakins Press Foundation books, in my opinion, that's so important is the materiality of them, that the book itself is worthy of its subject matter. So one of our philosophies is that we don't do it unless we can do it well. And that started as early as the 1960s with the first 2 books. The book on the top left was a collection of excerpts from the 4 Gospels that Thomas Jefferson put together and had printed himself for the use of his family. And the title, Human Jesus, is interesting because it was Jefferson's idea that the most important parts of the 4 Gospels were those that depicted Jesus not as a magician or a deity, but as a man. So he went and took out the parts that are sort of spectacular or otherworldly and focused on Jesus as a philosopher. The book on the top right is a partial facsimile of Benjamin Franklin's Bagatelles from Passy when he was in France as the ambassador. It's quite wonderful also, and it resonates with Leslie's ideas about how important the production of a book is. As you may know, Franklin was a bibliophile and also a printer and a designer and publisher himself. The lower left is one of my favorite books. It's the first Eakins Press Foundation book I read, The Bitch Goddess Success. And it's a collection of essays about the potential pitfalls of democracy, but mostly of capitalism. And there are some familiar names there, like Alexis de Tocqueville and Kennedy and James, etc. And the lower right, Fairy Tales for Computers, was published in 1969 or 1970, and it's a collection of essays about computers, which is kind of amazing. And the one that strikes me as still the most transcendent of them is a short story called The Machine Stops by E.M. Forrester that was published in 1920. It totally anticipates the internet. It's about a young man sitting in a room plugging into a hexagonally shaped cell, like a hive, below the surface of the earth and experiencing things like lectures and like the sea and like the sun, which is no longer accessible to him. It's really kind of prescient and amazing. In 1972-73, Leslie met an extraordinary man named Lincoln Kirstine. And forgive me for doing this, but it's my personal bellwether of our culture. How many people know who Lincoln Kirstine is? Okay, we have a very good audience. Lincoln and Leslie became dear friends, and at one point Lincoln referred to Leslie as his publisher. As many of you know, and some of you who don't should know, that Lincoln Kirstine brought George Balanchine to the United States in 1933 and started shortly thereafter the School of American Ballet, the New York City Ballet. And Lincoln was very much at the center of American culture, and certainly New York culture during those years. He just left Harvard. He was just finishing publishing Hound and Horn, which was one of the great early literary journals. He ran the Harvard Society for Contemporary Art, which was a precursor to what became the Museum of Modern Art, and he was instrumental in founding the Museum of Modern Art. So this is an extraordinary person whom Leslie immediately recognized as one of the great cultural figures of the 20th century, became dear friends with, and started publishing a number of books by or authored by Lincoln Kirstine. This was their first project together in 1973, and it's a book called Lay This Laurel, of photographs by Richard Benson of the St. Gaudens Monument on Boston Common to Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who had the 55th Regiment of African American soldiers in the Civil War. And Lincoln tells the story in quite a remarkable and compelling way. And it was really the first big book, or the first important book of the press that paired an essay and the photographs in a way that made them equally important. Because of Lincoln's deep involvement with ballet and Leslie's affinity for him, they published a number of books together that had to do with ballet, including small sort of keepsakes or festshrifts that had to do with celebrating a particular moment in the City Ballet's history, like Coppelia or the Stravinsky Festival. The book on the lower left is the book recently published and edited by Randy Borscheit of Lincoln Kirstine's program notes from 1935 until close to his death in 1996. And it's remarkable because it demonstrates the trajectory of his thoughts about educating a public that didn't know much about classical dance, about music, about movement, even about stage design and staging dance, about the history. And then gradually in the 1960s and the 1970s, you see the shift of the program notes, understanding that he, in fact, has achieved what he had intended, which was to create an audience for classical dance, and it gets into the more subtle, interesting relationships between the music and the movement, and also, in some cases, the history of the ballets themselves. In 1976, Leslie published this book, The American Monument, which is a selection of photographs by perhaps our most important still living photographer, Lee Friedlander. It was also very unusual, and like Message from the Interior, has come to be a very important volume in the history of publishing photography books. It's a ledger-style book, quite oversized, which is difficult to get the sense of in this slideshow. But it was also single sheets that were post-bound, and Leslie's idea was that somehow these books would make their way into every small-town library in the United States, and that some very sophisticated librarian would notice that they could be, these little rivets could be unscrewed, and the pages could be taken out, and the pictures could be put up on the walls. And there are photographs of, there are 213 of them. It's a big book, and you'll see as the design evolves, there are sometimes more than one on a page. And they're photographs that Lee made during thousands and thousands of miles of wandering. Of course, this would become one of his main sources for his photography, and still is, the road trip photography. And he photographed these monuments. Some of them are famous, Mount Rushmore, and most of them are these tiny little monuments that we see if we go to the main town square of some Kentucky or Texas town of 200 people, and the monument is dedicated to the person who invented the second stage of some rocket propulsion system in World War II. And they're quite obscure, and there's a lot of wonderful files and correspondence between one of the people who worked for the press in the early 1970s trying to figure out what these things are, including one wonderful letter from somebody who was running the Cody, Wyoming Chamber of Commerce, because there was a picture of Buffalo Bill Cody that that Lee had taken, and it was this person's very strong opinion after receiving a photostat of it and a query about what the nature of the sculpture was, that the pictures that she had enclosed in postcard form were much better than Lee's pictures, and she hoped that we would consider using them instead. In 1971, Walker Evans had a major retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. It was the first big exhibition that he'd had really in the city since his 1938 show. And of course, he went to Leslie, and he conspired to create an interview that would be published in Art in America, heavily edited by the two of them, and very coy and amusing and very reflective of their strong relationship with one another. And that it would, again, sort of give Walker Evans an opportunity to talk about the work that he'd done since and to talk about his philosophy, and Leslie was a great enabler in that way. And one of the first projects that Leslie and I worked on together after a catalog of the Eakins Press Foundation publications that was associated with an exhibition at the Zabriskie Gallery in 1993 was this book, Walker Evans Incognito, which is the essay reprinted because it had only before that point been available in collected photography essays and the original Art in America 1971 edition. So we printed this sort of oversized, beautiful volume of the interview and of the 9 photographs that Leslie and Walker chose for Walker to talk about for the article to give some idea of his pictures other than the famous ones. The next year, we published a portfolio of hand-pulled gravures, which is a process that is a part of the genesis of the Van Vechten work that we're going to talk about in a minute, where a photographic negative is turned into a photographic positive at the size that the finished picture will be, and it's etched onto a copper plate and pressed with ink into a fine piece of paper, in this case Reeves BFK. And they're very beautiful to see in person. And they're photographs that represent one of Walker's first projects when he returned from Paris. He expatriated himself, like so many other people, in the late 1920s with the idea of being a writer, and struggled with that all of his life, although it's arguable, and there's some new scholarship that I think will make a great case for this, that he was actually a great writer as well as a great photographer. Suffice it to say, he came back to the States thinking, well, here's this camera, and I'm going to take pictures as I walk across the Brooklyn Bridge when I go to visit my friend Hart Crane, who lives in Brooklyn. And the first pictures, among the first pictures of Walker's ever to be published, were a series, 1 in the Liverite edition and 3 in the Black Sun edition in 1930 of Hart Crane's The Bridge, which is an epic poem that begins with a short homage to the bridge called To Brooklyn Bridge. So this was, these we made from the original negatives. This picture on the top right, of course it's sort of teasing to say this, but you see the cables. The nature of the gravure process and the etched copper plate is that the darkest places are the places where the depth of the copper is the deepest and holds the most ink. And when you run your finger over a work print of this, you can feel the topography of the cable, so that it's actually a photograph that has a certain three-dimensionality to it, which is quite unusual. One of the great privileges of working with a small press that doesn't often, or perhaps ever, depending on when you ask me, have to subscribe to or accommodate the conventional difficulties of more trade publishing, is that we can work with small institutions that have great treasures that need to be coaxed into existence by perseverance and over a long period of time. That's one way of saying that projects can take 20 or 30 years to come to fruition without our losing interest in them or without them becoming irrelevant. And this book, which we published in 2009, is a collection of photographs by a man named Frederick W Glazier, who made pictures of the American circus during its heyday from 1890 to about 1925. And he's an extraordinary photographer. I could talk for 45 minutes about him, but I won't. The point is that his work, glass plate negatives from, as I said, the beginning of the century, the plastic didn't exist at this point as a substrate for photographic negatives. So he used glass plate negatives, which made them particularly vulnerable. And they ended up through a convoluted series of gifts and accident at the Ringling Museum of Art in Sarasota, Florida, where they were in the basement and got flooded by the bay, and then they dried out, and the emulsion fell off, and then they got flooded by the bay again. And finally somebody came around who knew that these things were valuable and actually put them up on something so they wouldn't get flooded. And then through a series of conservation and preservation and scanning got them mostly to a place where they were stable. And that's when I came along and talked with my colleague and friend down there, Debbie Walk, and convinced them to allow us to make a publication that would present Glazier's photographs not just as documents of the American circus, but also as important photographs in the canon of the history of American photography. His portraits in particular resonate with those made by some of his contemporaries whom we know he had no idea of, but they include Eugene Ache in Paris, E.J. Belloc in New Orleans, and August Sander in Germany. They were all working with basically the same camera at the same time. So it's a real pleasure to be able to create, to help preserve for posterity, a group of photographs that might not otherwise see the light of day and certainly wouldn't have an opportunity to be studied and appreciated the way that we do it. And that's also another way of saying that we take very seriously the responsibility to posterity to make sure that the books themselves will last and will be beautiful and will be, as I said earlier, worthy of their subject matter. We published a book 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, Jed, called Magicians and Charlatans. And this is a very important pivotal point for the press. Leslie died in 1997, and his wife Jane Mayhall died in 2009, and they didn't have children. So part of my early role there, and this is not something to get too deeply into here, but part of it, a lot of it had to do with taking care of them, which meant not really having the wherewithal, the energy, or the time, frankly, to be making a lot of new books, especially those that spoke to a very important part of our mission, which is to publish books that address issues that are of contemporary relevance, issues that are being currently embattled, is the phrase that Leslie used that's so wonderful. And Jed Pearl, who authored this collection, is somebody whom I'd known for quite a long time. He wrote a review of the Zabriskie Gallery Show in 1993 in which he said that the books of the Eakins Press Foundation are among the most beautiful in America. And when we brought that back, it was in the New Criterion, Leslie said, "Who is this guy? We got to meet this guy." So I'd known Jed for a long time, and he came to me one day with this manuscript, or an earlier version of it, and said, "This is something that you'd be interested in." And of course, not only are they beautifully written essays, some of which you will have been familiar with even if you haven't purchased this book because they were published in the New Republic, where Jed was the art critic for almost 3 decades. There's a great quote by John Ashbery that we put on the book that gets used a lot that I'll read just to flatter Jed and see if he turns red. "For years, Jed Pearl has been covering the art world with tremendous empathy and unsparing accuracy. His ability to recognize the traditional forms of art behind their continual transmutation has made his an almost solitary essential voice." So for me, not only was it a real pleasure to work with Jed to publish this book, but it felt like a reassertion of an important part of our mission. We had become, during those years, during Leslie's decline and Jane's decline, somewhat based heavily on our past, which is fine, but there has to be a contemporary component to that as well. And that's where Jed's book came in. It's also very beautifully produced, I think, and the reproductions are untypical of a book of collected essays because they're considered at the highest possible quality. He wrote about the Museum of Modern Art in quite a controversial way, and also Lincoln Kirstine, who is, as you know, very close to home for us, among many other things. Okay, that brings us to American Portrait's Harlem Heroes and the gentleman who made those photographs. This is a self-portrait of him, Carl Van Vechten. Van Vechten was born in Iowa in 1880, made his way to Chicago to study, and arrived in New York City in 1909, where very shortly after his arrival, he became the dance critic for the New York Times. And he wrote dance criticism throughout most of his first 20 or 30 years in the United States, as well as novels and other pieces of journalism. But he became a sort of bon vivant and man about town, actually more than sort of. He was an extraordinary version of that, and he befriended an incredible number of people. People who were important to the development of American culture during that period leading up to the war and then very much after the war. It wasn't until 1936 that he picked up a camera, and it was at that point that he stopped writing, or at least stopped publishing his novels. And in a way, we are grateful for that because the photographs that he made are extraordinary. And the pictures that you're about to see of 25 men and 25 women who were in one way or another, either directly, and you'll probably recognize who those are, or indirectly, a part of what we have now come to know as the Harlem Renaissance. And I want to say something important, which is that our book of these 50 people is not meant to define the Harlem Renaissance, nor is it necessarily meant to define the man Carl Van Vechten. I'd like to say that it's meant really to provide people with a compelling, at times very beautiful point of entry into what is an extraordinary period of history in the United States. The pictures derive from the James Weldon Johnson Memorial Collection at the Beinecke Library at Yale, which Van Vechten himself established in the 1940s and then continued to fund and deposit material to until his death. It's an extraordinary collection. The negatives are all there. They're a little bit less accessible now than they might be because the Beinecke's closed for renovation. But in 1979, 1980, Leslie went there and spent time with the curator, Donald Gallup, and looked at and began editing these pictures. So the 50 pictures are chosen by Leslie. Van Vechten made many more photographs, and many more photographs of people other than his friends from the Harlem Renaissance. But it was Leslie's idea to choose these particular people, and you'll notice there are some conspicuous absences, despite the fact that Van Vechten photographed, for instance, Billie Holiday. But we do have Ella Fitzgerald, and we do have Bessie Smith, and we do have Mahalia Jackson. And it would be interesting to hear Leslie articulate why he made some of those choices. I can paraphrase some of it, and for instance, you might ask, well, why is Lottie Allen here? Does anybody know Lottie Allen? Lottie Allen was a domestic worker in Harlem, and it was Leslie's idea that you didn't have to be Langston Hughes necessarily to embody the spirit of the movement. And that was very much in keeping with Leslie's morality, his idea that the everyman who lived his or her life in a particular manner was just as worthy of celebration, provided that there was some way to do that. And he saw Van Vechten's photographs of people, whether, as I say, of the particularly famous or the less famous, as an equally relevant part of what he wanted the subject matter to be. So I'm going to go through the 50 pictures, but I'll do it kind of quickly. And I'll do it again with the caveat that, like the book, my effort now is not to give you a definitive biography of these people or of the Harlem Renaissance, but to whet your appetite and remind you that there is still extraordinary material on the subject to be discovered and written about and recontextualized. And we all know that this is a time to recontextualize such things. Marian Anderson, one of the great opera singers, sang at the Lincoln Memorial in 1939 after having been forbidden by the Daughters of the American Revolution to play in Constitution Hall. And instead she had an audience of 10 or 12,000 people. There's a video of this. Has anybody seen the Jacob Lawrence show at the Museum of Modern Art? It is an extraordinary exhibition. There are two videos there. One of them is Marian Anderson singing at the Lincoln Memorial, and the other is Billie Holiday singing a late version of Strange Fruit. If you can survive those two videos and go on to see the rest of the exhibition, you're a strong individual. James Baldwin. Now, the other thing to remember, and just from a sort of photographic point of view, which is maybe not obviously, but a place that I come from and a place that I'm particularly interested in, it's good to remember that there's something important about access when it comes to making photographs of people, when it comes to making photographs of anything, really. And it's good to keep in mind that Van Vechten's access to these people, his ability to, for the most part, allow them to let their guard down, is an access that we subsequently benefit from all these years later. So that when you see James Baldwin in this kind of a relaxed state, in this kind of a casual state, in Van Vechten's apartment with his backdrops, this one a little bit less ornate than some of them that you'll see, it's good to remember that it's because of his relationship with these people that we have the kinds of photographs that we do, which you might say, compared to some of the more famous pictures of some of the famous people we'll see, are much less casual. Or much more casual, much less severe, much less about presenting a public facade that they needed in order to protect themselves. Romare Bearden just had an exhibition at the Columbia University Gallery, an extraordinary painter, again, another friend of Van Vechten's. And many of these people received extraordinary reward and celebration during their lifetime, others did not. Mary McLeod Bethune, the founder of Bethune-Cookman College, was an advisor to the Roosevelt administration at the White House. I mean, it's good to remember that in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, there was a strong culture, intellectual culture, of highly successful African Americans. Sometimes people need to be reminded of that, I think. Arna Bontemps, one of the great writers of the century, published more than 25 books, children's books, was a teacher, was at Yale University, curated the James Weldon Johnson collection from which these pictures derive. John W. Bubbles, tap dancer, from Buck and Bubbles. Ralph Bunche. Ralph Bunche was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating one of the early peace agreements between the Palestinians and the Israelis. An extraordinary figure. Countee Cullen, one of the great poets for whom the first New York Public Library in Harlem was named, which is now the Schomburg Collection, which you probably have heard of. Ossie Davis, the great actor, and his wife, Ruby Dee. I love the fact that even in the book, when these are presented in alphabetical order, they're together. The great W.E.B. Du Bois, head of one of the founders of the NAACP, editor of Crisis magazine, one of the great outspoken critics of McCarthyism. Katherine Dunham, one of the first great choreographers, had a troupe called Ballet Negre. In 1931, very early, she started her own dance school in the 1940s, received a National Medal of Arts. Again, these are just the little biographies. There is so much more to be known about these people. Ruby Elsie was a film star who acted with Paul Robeson, whom you'll see a little bit later on, and was in Porgy and Bess in 1937. The great Ella Fitzgerald. And I think this is an extraordinary picture of Ella Fitzgerald. When do we see her looking so relaxed? Althea Gibson, the great tennis star Althea Gibson, who broke the color barrier at Wimbledon in 1957. She was on the Ed Sullivan Show. She starred in Hollywood films. The great Dizzy Gillespie, father of bebop. W.C. Handy, blues man, the father of the blues. Roland Hayes, one of the great tenors. Alton L. Hines, another singer and actress. Again, it's good to remember that Van Vechten was quite playful in setting these pictures up. You see the backgrounds, for instance, with Hayes or Handy. He made these or appropriated them for the purpose. And all of these pictures, or almost all of them, were made in his studio on the Upper West Side. Nora Holt. She studied with Nadia Boulanger, wrote music criticism for the New York Amsterdam News and the Chicago Defender, and taught in the Los Angeles public school system for many, many years. The great Lena Horne. One of the wonderful things about this picture, which one would only know if one had access to the archives at the Beinecke, and I'll show you a little bit later on, but maybe you'll just put it in the back of your mind so when we get to the picture of Joe Louis, you can notice that they're the same backgrounds, and that the picture of Joe Louis was made by Van Vechten at Lewis's training center up on the Hudson, and this was a period when Lena Horne and Joe Louis were having an affair that no one knew about. And it's there in the consecutive negatives, which is quite wonderful. There's one of the next pictures is of them in a rowboat. The great Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes and Van Vechten had a long, important relationship during which Van Vechten was instrumental in introducing Langston Hughes to Alfred Knopf, which resulted in Hughes's first publication of poems. Zora Neale Hurston. The great Mahalia Jackson. Mahalia sang at many of the important marches on Washington, including one that we're going to see a little bit later. Charles Johnson, the Johnson brothers were his subjects as well. He was an authority on urban sociology and race relations. He founded the journal Opportunity, which was an extraordinarily important place for African-American intellectual ideas to be communicated, and was the president of Fisk University. J. Rosamond Johnson, who was a musician and composer, was trained at the New England Conservatory, and he wrote what is often referred to as the African-American anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing, as well as many spirituals. and the great James Weldon Johnson, for whom Van Vechten named the collection from which these pictures come, who was a giant, really, of 20th century black literature. He was the head of the NAACP, among many other things. And the great Jacob Lawrence, whom we've already referred to earlier this evening. I really encourage people to go see that show, the Migration Series show that's at the Museum of Modern Art through September. This picture was made within a matter of weeks after he finished painting those 60 pictures, the Migration Series pictures. One of the things that you don't see in this show that you will in the book is the information that faces each of the photographs, which is a very simple name, birth date, death date, if relevant, and it's only not relevant in one person's case, which I'll get to in a minute. And then a brief biographical statement and sometimes an excerpt or a quote by or about the person. And Jacob Lawrence, this is one of my favorites, he says, just in simple quotes, "I have an assuredness of myself." 1941. Alain Locke, who was a very important photographer and wrote a book that became one of the books that Martin Luther King carried around with him called The New Negro. Was a Rhodes Scholar, taught at Howard University for more than 3 decades, really one of the kind of pioneers of African-American intellectual ideas. Here's the picture of Joe Louis that I mentioned earlier. I don't know if you can remember in your mind's eye the background that was with Lena, but here it is. And we all know about Joe Louis, right? Beating Max Schmeling during the height of the rise of the Third Reich. There are some amazing pieces of footage of that fight, including, and some subsequent pieces of footage of Max Schmeling carrying Joe Louis's coffin. Not everybody knows that they became lifelong friends, and that there was a period that Max Schmeling actually sent money to Joe Louis to bail him out of a difficult period in his life. Rose Mcclendon was a great playwright and actress, was the founder of the Negro People's Theater in Harlem, which was a very important theater during the 1930s and 40s. Claude McKay came from Jamaica, was a great poet from Jamaica, was the national poet in 1977. Mildred Perkins. This is an interesting story, I think. Mildred Perkins was another domestic worker in New York City about whom we, until very recently, knew nothing. And it turns out, after having found buried in his letters to Gertrude Stein, that Carl Van Vechten refers to her in glowing terms over a period of many years, and she used to cook for him. So it's kind of amazing to think, for more than 35 years, that she was one of his subjects as well. Vera Peterson was the first medical doctor, first African-American medical doctor to come out of Barnard College. There's a scholarship still there to this day for her. Horace Pippin was one of the great African-American painters of this period, along with Bearden and Lawrence. And this is kind of an extraordinary story. He was injured in World War I, and it was his right arm, or his favored arm, writing arm, that was injured, and his doctor said that you needed to take up some sort of repetitive activity to help heal the muscles and the nerves, and he started painting. Dorothy Porter graduated from Howard and Columbia University, wrote many important essays, cultural essays, on African-American culture during the time, and was a librarian at the Moreland Spingarn Collection at Harvard University for 2 decades. The great Leontyne Price, you might notice that she's the only one that doesn't have a death date. She's one of the great opera singers. There's a video online of her singing Verdi at her farewell at the Met. And just as she hits the kind of penultimate note, the person who's filming it is so moved that they drop the camera. The great Paul Robeson was a football player and a valedictorian at Rutgers. Went on to earn a law degree from Columbia University, was a celebrated actor, and was one of the few people in this group, but one of many people from the period whose life was nearly destroyed by McCarthyism. He was blacklisted, and his career certainly was destroyed. Here's a very unusual picture, I think, of Bill Bojangles Robinson, who invented the so-called stare tap dance, and also, interestingly enough, coined the word copacetic. If anybody still uses copacetic, that comes from Bill Bojangles Robinson. Edith Sampson was the first woman to receive a Master's of Law from Loyola. The first woman to receive a master's, not the first black woman. She was the first black woman to serve as a delegate to the United Nations. She traveled all over the world under the auspices of the State Department and became a municipal court judge in the late 1940s. And then, of course, the Empress of Blues herself, Bessie Smith. Maxine Sullivan, one of the great jazz singers, founded the house that jazz built in Harlem, 1970. Howard Swanson was an IRS agent and a United States Postal Service agent, but also a composer who achieved some renown during that period in his life. Sara Victor. Anybody ever hear of Sara Victor? Sara Victor was the pastry chef at the Algonquin Hotel. Now, we knew that, but we didn't quite know why or how important she was. And the New York Times fairly recently has not just digitized their microfilm collection from the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, they've also done whatever technology Google applies to books that allows the actual page to be read and searched. So we periodically were doing searches for some of these people. When we did a search for Sara Victor, we found not one but two full-page articles in the New York Times. One of them was her obituary, and the other was coverage of her funeral. And the reason that she's so important is because her pastries were so well liked that Dorothy Parker arranged what became known as the vicious circle at the Algonquin because of Sara Victor, and that's why it happened there. You can still go across the street to the Algonquin and go into not the headache-inducing blue bar, but the main room, and you can find in the back a round table, which is where these great salons took place, and Sara Victor would have been positioned nearby. So this is new. This is information we found literally about 3 weeks before going to press. Margaret Walker, the author of the great book Jubilee, poet as well. Freddie Washington is a great actress who was with Paul Robeson and sang with Duke Ellington. Director of the Negro Arts Guild. Ethel Waters, another actress, was in Broadway films, Broadway and Hollywood films. Also sang in an evangelical choir. Josh White, who is a great folk singer. And Richard Wright, whom we all know. And then this is a quote that Van Vechten wrote for an article in Esquire that says something I think important about his ideas about photography and what it can do. Photography is the most exigent of mistresses, both demanding and rewarding depending on the amount of success achieved. It becomes an addiction, even an affliction, or an enchantment. It is probably the most fascinating of arts, if it is an art, and the more time spent on understanding its possibilities and its limitations, the more brilliant are the consequences. Spoken like a true photographer. Now, I hadn't thought that I would show anybody these pictures for a little while, but tonight seems to be as good a night as any to introduce our next book, which is coming out in the fall, which we're printing in exactly a month. And it's a collection of photographs by Lee Friedlander made on May 17th, 1957 in Washington, D.C. in an event called the Prayer Pilgrimage for Freedom. And it's a remarkable group of pictures for a couple of different reasons. One is that Lee was 22 years old, and it was one of his first projects, and no one's ever seen them before. The other is that it was one of the most important and to a large degree, underappreciated marches of this nature. In 1963, we think of as the big one. But this one was important because it really positioned Martin Luther King as the spokesperson for the civil rights movement. He gave a speech there known as Give Us the Ballot, in which he demanded equal voting rights. And this march, which was organized for the to take place on exactly the day of the 3rd anniversary of the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision, really was what set the tone for and created the momentum for what would become a number of years later the Voting Rights Act. And Lee had access to the stage. He'd met with Bayard Rustin in New York to see if there might be some way that he could get a special pass to the stage, which indeed he did, and he made lots of wonderful pictures of lots of, at the time, important and famous people. But he spent a lot of time in the crowd photographing some of the 25,000 men, women, and children who came from all over the East Coast and as far as Chicago to be a part of this rally. So the beginning of the book sort of has these pictures of people in the audience, and It started at noon, and there was a multiple-hour program until the end of the day with about 15 different presenters or singers. And you see people in the crowd and sort of waiting and wary, and gradually he gets closer to the stage. There are 58 pictures in the book. I'm just showing you a handful here, but this one I particularly like, this Boy Scout. And Lee is actually quite wonderfully eloquent about how these people dressed to come to this event, similar to the way they might dress to come to church, and how important it was. They dressed for the day. And then, of course, on the stage, there were lots of important people. Harry Belafonte on the left there, Mahalia Jackson in the middle. And I think this is an amazing picture of Martin Luther King. What photographer would make this picture of Martin Luther King? And it has all the power that you would want, but there he is kissing the left border, and somehow still the main focus of the photograph. One of the great coups of our forthcoming book is that the Martin Luther King rights and estate has allowed us to reproduce in facsimile the 5 pages that came out of his typewriter that were the speech of the day. So that's something to look forward to in September. I want to give you guys a chance to ask some questions, so if you have any, and they can be about anything that has to do with what we've looked at tonight or publishing in general. And I think that there's a microphone. Meg, are you going to help me out there? But if you can just raise your hand, then we can bring a mic to you. Hope somebody has a question or two. Martika.
Thank you. I just would be very interested to know a little more about where your printing is done, the technical and production end of this, so it makes them come out looking so beautifully.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you asked that question. Not many people are very interested in that, but it's something that's very important to us. And there are a series of designers that I work with, and a series of printers, a couple of different binders, and we make decisions about where to print and who to use for production based on the kind of book it is. So if it's a book of black and white photographs, we might take it to one place. If it's a book of primarily text-based with a few illustrations, we might take it to another place. The Oh Write My Name book of Van Vechten's pictures was printed in East Greenwich, Rhode Island at a place called Meridian Printing, which in my opinion is one of the great houses anywhere in the world. But by contrast, for instance, the Frederick W Glazier book, the Circus book, was printed in Verona, Italy, at a place called Trifolio. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's essential to us that they be as good as they can be. And another thing that's worth mentioning apropos of that is that I have the great privilege working at the press to work only with people I like. We're small. We're not for profit. We have a modest endowment, and I raise money for every project I do. And I like my authors, and I like my designers, and I like the people I print with, and it's a delightful pleasure and a part of the whole piece to work with them all in as much in the capacity towards production. And they all realize what they're doing. They know that this is something that's likely to live longer than any of us, and that's something that we remember in the process. And I don't mean that in a morbid way, Jed. I see you smirking. Anybody else have a question? I hope that answered your question, Martika.
Oh, thank you. You mentioned the photo engraving process, and I'm familiar with that from the 1960s. Is that still utilized today, or is that just gone?
Well, another good question. It's utilized today in some regards, but like many things that were produced or invented for commercial purposes and then got replaced by something more efficient, the people who use them now are different people. So a rotogravure technician in 1966 or 67 was printing thousands and thousands of advertisements. Somebody who's printing sheet-fed gravure today is working for, and actually I believe that the last press, Twin Palms Press out west, that was still using it and had a Japanese printer that was still doing it, and I think that that's finally ceased. But it went from being the cheapest process to being one of the most expensive processes because it became less viable as a commercial printing means. So people are still doing it, and people are still doing the sort of hand version of the sheet-fed gravure, which is what we call the hand-pulled gravure, which is actually the same process as rendering and etching. You put it through an etching press. And it's not just as simple as that. There's a lot of expertise that goes into how to properly etch the plate and how to plate the plate with metal so that the copper doesn't get soft after a number of impressions, and different kinds of carbon-based inks to be used. And indeed, there are still photographers that are using that as their main means of making their prints. And there's a man named John Goodman who printed our Walker Evans Brooklyn Bridge portfolio in 1994, who's still making particularly good gravure, hand-pulled gravure prints in Western Massachusetts. Other questions? Yeah. Edward?
Thank you. Regarding the Glazier book of circus photographs, the negatives were glass negatives. Did you make prints first and then print the book from the prints that were made from the glass negatives? And if so, describe, please, the prints that you made from the glass negatives.
Yes. I wish I had it in this lecture, because the process is a really important part of the conservation. And I'll premise that by quoting one of our sort of mantras, which is that technology is a tool that need not outmode humanity. And it was Leslie's strong belief, and it's mine, and it's the belief of the press, that technology isn't evil by itself. Certainly it can be used to evil ends. It is a tool to be used by people who know how to use the tools. So in the case of the Glazier photographs, for instance, there have actually been a number of really essential steps in the conservation of those negatives. It started with an NEH grant in the 1980s, and the photographer Jerry Ulsman, who was teaching a photography program nearby, who similarly recognized the importance of these. And wanted to conserve them. So he made a series of contact prints after a man named Doug Munson, who is one of the great negative conservators in the world, who was hired for a number of years to conserve the Walker Evans negatives at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He was hired with this NEH grant to preserve what he could of the emulsion from these glass plate negatives, which was falling off and damaged. And then prints were made from the original glass plate negatives, and it's the prints, the contact prints that we used. We subsequently scanned them and went in. A man named John Hill, who was a brilliant printer, was actually the executor to the Walker Evans estate. If you haven't figured it out yet, it's quite a small world at the Eakins Press. And he spent hours and hours on each of these images, being very careful not to change the picture, but to bring back where there was broken emulsion, and even to preserve Glazier's hand, because in some cases there's a thumbprint, so quite literally it's his hand. In other cases you see the crop marks, or he's gone into the background of the negatives to retouch them. So then we subsequently printed them, because the important component to that book was to create a traveling exhibition. And there was an exhibition at the UBS Art Gallery over here on 6th Avenue in 2009, just before the book came out, and it now travels. It's been exhibited in China, it's been exhibited all over Florida. It was a part of an exhibition of the history of the circus at the Bard Graduate Center a number of years ago. I don't know if anybody saw that. So the prints are actually digital inkjet prints. The files that we made the book from are digital files, and they come from contact prints made from the original glass plate negatives. So there's a sort of technological trajectory through it all. At each stage, there has to be a level of sensitivity for what gets changed and what doesn't.
Quick follow-up. Your digital files, what resolution do you use?
They're 64-bit. Most scans, for instance, are 8-bit, and pardon the people who aren't interested in that. And their files are about a half a gigabyte to a gigabyte each. So they're it's not like they're 7,200 DPI. I think they're mostly at 600 or 700 DPI, but they have so many layers, and the means by which they're reproduced with 10 different colors of carbon-based black ink, for instance, allows for that incredible tonal range, which is translated into the book as well. The book is printed in tritone instead of duotone, which is 3 different colors instead of the 2 different colors, so it allows for greater resolution. I think a couple more questions. Pat?
I'm curious about how you decide what book you're going to do. And in this particular book that you're telling us about, how and when did you decide to do this?
Oh, I love that question. When I started working with Leslie in 1991 or 92, It was a time, this is a long story, but just quickly, it was a time when he had decided to shut down the Eakins Press Foundation. He had Parkinson's disease and not a lot of energy. I was a student at New York University at the time, and he said, he found out I was on the wrestling team, and he said, well, you must be kind of strong. Do you want to help me move some boxes? And he paid me $6 an hour or something for a couple of weeks until we realized that we had quite an affinity for one another, and instead of shutting the press down, we started publishing new books. And one of the sources for those new books are the, at that time, and still to a certain degree today, are the really rich files at the Eakins Press Foundation. We're 50 years old now plus, and the way that we work is to have an idea and start a file and explore it and sort of mine a vein that might be interesting and might not be interesting and accumulate more material, and it either gains a natural momentum or it doesn't. And in the case of, so there's still lots of projects, so to speak, in the pipeline. In the case of the Oh Write My Name book, I mentioned that it was produced as a portfolio in the 1980s. I didn't get into too much detail about that, but in fact it was the most ambitious project of the press to date. And it took 4 or 5 years for Leslie to edit those photographs from the Beinecke collection and to write the captions. He raised money from the Kaplan Fund, Ford Foundation, the NEA, and the NEH. He got private funding from people like George O'Keeffe, and he had hired Richard Benson, who's the McCarthy Award winner, a guru of printing, to work for almost a decade on experimenting with different types of printing processes, et cetera, and it all led to the hand-pulled gravure process of these 50 pictures with letterpress captions that are more or less the same captions as are what's in the book. And we were initially going to produce 100 copies of this thing for distribution to libraries and museums that would have public access. We ultimately only made about 35 of them, but they're in the collections from Harvard to Howard, from the Smithsonian to the Newark Museum, to the New York Public Library, to the Schomburg Center, to the Boston Public Library. They're distributed pretty widely. But of course the intention had always been to get it into the hands of as many people as possible, which a limited edition, expensive, big in terms of the amount of space it takes up portfolio didn't quite do as effectively as we wanted. So it had always been Leslie's intention to publish a book, and it just never came to pass. And it's been something I've been working on for 10 years. No, more than that. 15 years. Now, I haven't been working continuously on it for 15 years. I'm not that slow. But it gained a natural momentum. This felt like the right time. And the decisions about what books get published have to do with my sort of private dedication to fulfilling the project that Leslie and Katz and I worked on together until his death. And also ideas that I think are continuing a thread that is the spine, really, of the ideas and that Leslie started with the press. So I've said no to projects that I think are brilliant, that just don't fit into what we do at the Eakins Press. So, I mean, the short answer to your question is that I decide based on the history that I have with Leslie and what I think fits with what we publish. Now, I don't do it in a vacuum. I know Karen, who is our program coordinator, is brilliant and has great ideas, and I'm sure that we'll collaborate even more and more. She's only been with me for a year. I have a board of directors, a very small board of directors, but wonderful people who have good ideas. And like I said, I've got a pretty significant, deep archive where others are coming from. So we already have ideas for the books for next year and the year after. I'll also mention that this year is the first year since 1978 or 79 that the Eakins Press Foundation will have published 2 books in a year. We normally publish a book every year or 18 months, which gives us, of course, a great privilege of doing it really well and making sure that it's well researched and well conceived as an object. We take one more question? Yeah. I think the mic has to come to you, otherwise you won't be recorded for posterity.
I thought I saw one color picture. It was the interior of the Museum of Modern Art, I think?
Yes.
So do you reproduce color photos?
Sure. Oh. I've got nothing against color photos, although that picture was mostly, actually I'm glad you mentioned that picture, because it has a sort of funny story to it. Jed's essay about the Museum of Modern Art is called MoMA Inc., as in incorporated. It's not a particularly flattering assessment of the museum. And I had a friend who was one of the directors of publication at the Museum of Modern Art when we were publishing this book, and I called her up and I said, so-and-so, I said, we're looking for a picture of the museum for our new book to illustrate it. And she said, Peter, what's the book? And I said, oh, it's the book of collected essays that I mentioned to you by Jed Pearl. And she said, and which essay is it? And I said, I think we both know which essay it is. She said, if I even mention his name in the halls of the Museum of Modern Art, people cringe. So they wouldn't give us a picture, which is different than some other people that Jed didn't speak too highly of, but we'll get into that another time. So what I did is I went with my wonderful assistant at the time, Heather Althoff, and she made this picture, and we put it in the book. But again, this is not I mean, it's a wonderful photograph, but it's not meant to be a work of art. It's meant to illustrate some aspect of the museum about which Jed was writing in the article. Are you bringing the hook? We have one more question. And we have books over here, if you're interested, not all of them, but a selection of 5. And then some wine and things in the back. So I hope you'll stick around. You can ask me questions in person. But I think we have one more.
So you would say that you can reproduce a black and white photograph that's as good as the print itself from the negative?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to reproduce the print, yes, you can get pretty close. But what's interesting, I'm glad you asked that question. For instance, the Van Vechten photographs, the book that's over there. Van Vechten was notoriously laissez-faire about his process of printing and developing film. So there's a vast inconsistency in his 35mm negatives. And when you see a Van Vechten print, more often than not, it's not particularly well processed. In his darkroom, it's not particularly carefully cropped. The exposure might be off. The contrast is a little bit dim or too bright. And so one of the things that has happened at every step, every really laborious and significant step of the evolution of the 50 pictures that we have published, is, with Richard Benson being involved, figuring out how to overcome the technical obstacles created by Van Vechten's casual attitude toward the technique, and make the pictures feel like they belong together as a group, so that there's a similarity to the tonal range and the depth and the rendering of black skin, of the backdrops, etc. And the gravure was a particularly good process for that. But when we translated it into ink, yet again, those whole new set of considerations had to be made, because we actually used the positives, the film positives that were made in 1982 and 83, to make the gravures. We used those and scanned those to make the separations to print the duotone book. So there was yet another iteration, yet another interpretation. And the man who did that is a man named Thomas Palmer, who was Richard Benson's protege and worked with him for 35 or 40 years. And so that not only is there a technical lineage, there's also a personnel lineage. And we were on press looking at the last of the press sheets coming off and sort of being self-congratulatory about how beautiful the reproductions were. And he said, you know, they're not really reproductions. And I said, you're quite right. They're original photographs, because you will not find another version of Van Vechten's photographs like this. Each step has been such an important, careful interpretation or reinterpretation of what was there before. So I don't know if that's not sort of a playful way of answering your question that I think evolved out of my description of the Walker Evans book, which really was meant to be a new version of the pictures. It wasn't a reproduction in the sense that, oh, here's this print that's for sale at Christie's, or here's this photograph that's in an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this is an exhibition catalog. We want it to look like the print. That's not how we work. We have the idea that the book exists on its own. I think that's it, guys, so we can have time to drink some wine. But thank you very much. It gives me great pleasure to talk about this stuff. It's been a great audience.